let's say, I'm a company and I've got a sales team, and we know content's important, um, but like convince me that like I can't live without this function. Like tell me why I can't. Like what's the consequences if we don't have it?
Yeah, great question. I think the most serious one is that there's no consistent review process for reviewing and improving content in a sales engagement platform, which is a problem that typically happens when you give salespeople full access to create and make content live in an SEP. And what happens is that reps end up cloning a sequence and shifting it just a little bit to match their voice, which, I've been there as a rep. Like, it makes a ton of sense that reps would want to do that. But what happens is that from your SEP, you're not really able to get meaningful data because a sequence doesn't have enough sense to actually tell you what's working and what's not. And essentially what you have then is a really good workflow tool that can automate some of your process for your reps. So you don't lose all the functionality, but from a high level perspective, some of those sequences might have a 7% response rate and others might have, like a 20% response rate. And but because maybe one person is only sending that sequence to really warm leads and the other one is sending it to really cold leads, like you don't have consistency. You can't control as many variables as possible, which prevents you from running successful experiments. And so, that meme like, oh, should that meeting have been an email? Like, I think in content the equivalent would be, should that sequence have been an A/B test? Like, do you really need to clone that sequence and make a new sequence, or could you A/B test a couple of these things that maybe you prefer to say differently and actually send it 100 times and see what works better? Because a lot of times what reps like better isn't actually what's really effective. And one of the main goals of an SEP is to get meaningful data over time when you're scaling your content. So if there's not a consistent review process and you're not really aware of duplicate content or gaps in your content, you don't really have that functionality at all.
Yeah. So I think the word that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about ownership is the word driver, and that like the owner. I think what you're saying here is that there has to be a review process and an approval process and all that, but like somebody's got to drive that. Someone has
Yep.
to drive that home, making sure that it's actually happening, that like the wheel is turning, right? No matter how slow and how big that wheel feels like, some days you're trying to push it, right? You got to get that wheel going, and that content owner is the one that drives that process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another thing on that note too is that when we start to get into working with larger companies, that have several teams across different regions, even if it's, only in North America, let's say, but you have like 3 or 4 teams across the country, that content is typically managed on a team level, which makes sense if your team's in an office together. At least at some point they were in an office together. They're probably going to be sending similar sales plays. But if you don't have insights from what's working across the different teams, one team might have figured out like, hey, this sales play works really, really well for us, and other teams might not know, and managers might not be incentivized or reps might not be incentivized to actually scale that across the whole org. But obviously, as an executive sponsor of something like implementing an SEP, I want all the teams to be successful, and I want to scale my best practices across the whole org. And if you don't have that bird's eye perspective and there's no one owning the entire process of the content supply chain, nobody really is accountable for making sure that all the data is sort of aggregated and used to tell a story, to learn something about your sales messaging, and then be able to reiterate to make it more successful.